clarify whether an independent Scotland would have to reapply for membership of the EU?
Well, no, we wouldn't.
I would like to ask the First Minister a familiar question about whether a separate Scotland would be a member of the EU. Yesterday, the Spanish Foreign Secretary
Hello, this is the first For All That podcast, and as usual I'm fighting the temptation to say hello and welcome. Yeah, so we're going to start this every week, hopefully. It'll be a little chat about the biggest stories of the week, absurd scare stories, legal questions. There's been a lot this week in particular, and we'll have different guests on every week, and most of the time I think it's going to be myself and Andrew Tickell. Andrew. Yeah. We can leave that in, actually.
That in, I appreciate it. Everyone gets one tickle and then I kill them with a blunt spoon.
Yeah, but, it's the same guy that's been getting persecuted in the thick of it. No, it's not. It's actually Lallands Peat Worrier, you might know him as, but Andrew Tickell is the correct one, and we'll have different guests on. So, given that introduction that you've just heard, stop me if you've heard this one before, I suppose the legal bit's been the big story of this week. And given that law's kind of your area, what have you been thinking about it?
Well, obviously, as you say, the big question...
What is your area? Sorry.
It's my area, yeah. Well, the big question this week has obviously been on the legal advice which may or may not have been given, which one can and cannot confirm, about whether Scotland would remain within the EU, whether it would have to join again, whether it would have to go through a whole range of different processes involving the euro, involving the Schengen area. So it's kind of a very complex legal and political area, I'd say. And I think this week the focus has really not been so much actually on the law, what the position of the EU is, which is, as I say, a tricky question, but has been about the politics, about is Alex Salmond exposed on this question? Is he a liar, a barefaced liar, says Paul Martin? And the various attempts by the media and by the opposition parties to really nail him, I think, on a personal basis, as having fibbed to Andrew Neil and be a kind of great fibber to the Scottish people as well.
Well, that's actually what I found the most amazing thing about this week. It's been not any concern to find out the answer, it's who can score points or who can avoid saying anything. And, like, the opposition, Salmond obviously doesn't want to say anything now. He'll say he's got his reasons, the ministerial code and whatnot. But the others are just, they don't seem to care about the answer. It's just get Salmond again and the same question and repeat it because they know that he might be in a tricky legal position. I don't think they actually care about the answer.
I think that's an interesting... I wrote a blog earlier on this week about First Minister's questions, which I don't usually do, but I just thought it was really interesting, just in line with what you just said there. There are really two ways I think you can take this controversy. You can say, is the main question about the position of an independent Scotland within the EU and what legal advice we may have or what legal reckoning we may have about what that position is likely to be? Or is it a question about Salmond personally? Is it a personal attack? And I saw that a former SNP spinner, Ewan Crawford, was on Scotland Tonight, and his view, essentially condensed, was haters gonna hate, that actually this was just an expression of people in the Labour Party and to a lesser extent perhaps the Tory Party who just hate Alex Salmond and see it as a pretext to go after him. And I think there is something actually to that, I mean, he wasn't exactly a kind of independent speaker when he was saying that, but I think Ewan is pointing at the fact that the more interesting question for unionists pursuing their argument might be the EU position, not that Salmond's a liar, not that he lacks credibility, not that he's a habitual fibber. But instead they are so kind of blinded by the enthusiasm to pin him as such, reveal him as such to the Scottish people. We always knew this man was this way, that they were unable to resist that line on it. And I think in the consequence of doing so, both Joanne Lamont and Ruth Davidson totally bungled their their case against Salmond by massively overstating and personalising what would have been much more interesting as a broader question about, well, what do we know about Scotland's position in the EU? What do we know about the UK's future position in the EU as well?
Well, yeah, that was the ironic thing. Like, at the same time as Ruth Davidson here is, drumming in, oh, well, we might not be in the EU, oh, that's terrible. A Conservative put forward a private member's bill in London about withdrawing from the EU, and they're discussing that in London whilst their Scottish leaders pursuing a totally different agenda.
And flirting as well with a referendum, potentially making commitments for a future Conservative and indeed Labour Party manifesto, and including a referendum, an in-out referendum on the EU in those. I agree, and it's an attempt, I think, to argue that the balance of uncertainty for independence is all one way, that only nationalists, Scottish nationalists that is, have to deal with uncertainty about the future. And I think if we allow ourselves to be drawn into that kind of argument and to admit that kind of premise, we're jiggered. That actually the position of the UK in the EU is as much, I think, an uncertainty as the position of a more Europhile Scotland is on it. The question is not whether you have uncertainty, but how upfront you are about talking about it and about what the basic it's not about whether you're uncertain or not. It's a question about talking honestly about where the uncertainties lie, both for the UK and for an independent Scotland. That's my view anyway.
Okay, the question that wasn't asked, which I always look for, is sorry for getting a bit Asterix here, but would the sky fall on our heads if we weren't actually in the EU for a little spell, even? That's one, like, in the last podcast with Rebecca McKinley, we talked about the situation with Norway, where they're kind of half in it and half not in it. Would it be a complete disaster if we weren't in the EU? Would the sky fall on our heads within 10 minutes, all contracts cancelled, the place is a disaster? I'm not convinced it would be like that.
No, I mean, I think, well, firstly, the sort of idea that everything turns on a single moment, that independence will be one great calamitous or heroic moment, isn't really convincing. It's going to be a kind of slow process if Scots endorse the fundamental principle. But, I mean, equally, though, on the other hand, we're not told very often about the good things that we get out of the EU. The free movement of persons, the ability to move capital around, the absence of passports if you're in particular Schengen sort of areas. And actually there would be consequences for Scots, and more importantly perhaps, for the UK, if the UK was not part of the EU.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we do.
Hearing a strange noise at home, that's my cat who's just decided to go to the bathroom at the moment.
That's an elegant feline you have.
Yeah.
But I think that's what's most important. It's most important that actually within the UK, the kind of positive case for the good things that we get out of the EU often isn't made. And actually, I think the absence of that is really kind of stark in the UK debate about should we be part of the EU and not just perhaps a kind of limited common market kind of idea.
So you think the legal position is vague, or do you think it's clear?
Well, I should say, yeah, I mean, my view, I'm not an EU law specialist at all. But I try and listen to people who know more about this than I do in a kind of non-partisan way. And my understanding is a wee bit like the independence referendum, that it's debatable. I mean, Neil Walker had an article earlier on today, he's a professor of law in Edinburgh, saying that it's somewhere between the kind of claims that we're getting at the moment that Scotland would be definitely in or definitely out, legally that is. And I would tend to believe him, that actually, it's never happened before is one point that he makes. We've never really had this in a European state. So there isn't a precedent, there isn't a binding clear precedent for this. So it's going to have to be negotiated. It'll be negotiated on a political level and a legal level, but fundamentally the answers to this are political. And I find it really difficult to imagine that the EU would not be interested in an independent Scotland whose citizens have already been EU citizens since the late 70s.
With a whole load of oil.
With a whole lot of oil, but also, it's politically important. The EU is an expansionist sort of project. It may have reached its kind of the limits of the circumference that the French, the Germans may be comfortable with. But Scotland is definitely within that circumference. It is already, and I can't see that an independent Scotland would be politically something that the EU would be interested in keeping out of the circle.
No, I mean, I think for financial reasons, there's a couple of Eastern European countries that they're erecting barriers to keep out, but I think they'd certainly want to keep Scotland in it as well.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so I suppose the other big story of the week, or biggest, would be the under-16s bit, and also how that ties in with the prisoners. Personally, I don't see any problem with prisoners voting. People are still people. It's the only way I see it. Prisoners should be allowed to vote.
Yeah.
I don't know what you think about it.
I would tend to agree, and just to give a wee bit of the background around this, that there's been confirmation from the Scottish Government this week that 16-year-olds will be able to vote and that they will be passing enabling legislation quite soon in order to find a practical way to do it. But I was particularly struck this week by a blog by the Scone pasty and occasionally Scots Law blogger Love and Garbage, who pointed out that under European human rights law, that Scotland and Holyrood is likely to be in a position where they'll be obliged to give a vote in the referendum to prisoners. You may have seen the whole controversy in the UK about Hurst, which was a decision of the European Court of Human Rights, which decided basically that a blanket ban on prisoners voting was incompatible with the European Convention of Human Rights. Mm-hmm. The interesting thing is, while in Westminster they're able to say, oh, we refuse to abide by this, we are a sovereign parliament, Holyrood isn't a sovereign parliament, and under the Scotland Act, it's obliged to uphold the European Court's judgments of what human rights mean. So as a result, Love and Garbage argues, and I think quite persuasively, that it will be difficult for Holyrood to find a way not to give 16-year-old prisoners, 70-year-old prisoners a vote on Scottish independence, which is a bit politically tricky, because although you and I, Michael, are quite comfortable with the idea of prisoner voting, Alex Salmond isn't, and he said so in Holyrood in an answer in 2010 at the kind of height of this controversy. And I'm pretty sure that it's something which actually the parties in Holyrood haven't really considered. So it promises to be a potentially legally rather sticky predicament for the SNP and then for the Holyrood in general, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. Do you think a lot of political opposition to it might be, fear of what the Daily Mail will say?
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, no, very much so. I mean, and we see in Westminster it's come up again. That's what the neat tie-in is here up to a point. With in Westminster, Dominic Grieve, who's the Attorney General responsible for advising the UK government on its law obligations, has said that the government isn't really in a position to say to the European Court, well, why don't you go and buzz off? Or at least they can't do so and comply with their international obligations. While David Cameron, who notoriously felt physically sick, I think he said, at the idea of prisoners voting, has been rather more bullish in his.
David Cameron, I usually feel he's physically sick. So.
Oh well, I just need a more rugged constitution. So does he. So there's an interesting kind of split emerging, I think, in what the UK government intends to do on. But actually, this argument has never really extended seriously to Scotland before. I don't think I've ever heard any Scottish politician, apart from an odd remark at First Minister's questions once, what do you think about prisoners voting in general? So this might bring it crashing straight into the heart of this already very contentious referendum process.
The more general point about under-16s voting, there's going to be some legal wrangling about that as well. Not only the specific issue of prisoners. There's also talk about, what's going to happen on the register. You can't give away the addresses of under 16s. Like, what ways can they have to get around that? Do you know anything about how they're going to be able to do this in the legislation?
I don't, to be honest. I mean, I've not really looked into that, but as you say, people have been arguing, like Jackie Bailey, Labour, MS people, one that there are child protection issues. I don't know if that's really very convincing, but the interesting thing was that in his conference speech, Alex Salmond said that they were going to introduce paving legislation for this within weeks, which is rather startling considering that they've not even cut the kind of final deal on the referendum legality with Westminster. But he said within weeks, which suggests at the very least that the Scottish government, if not me, has a very clear idea of how it will practically get this done, which I think is a really encouraging sign for those that think that 16-year-olds should be able to vote in general and that 16-year-olds should be able to vote in particular in this referendum.
Yeah. I think it's also, as a more philosophical, general point about society, I think like the fact that so many politicians feel comfortable disenfranchised